I think any trauma therapy, it's certainly true of somatic experiencing, is a therapy that brings us back into our bodies and into life, to be feeling alive and real and alive and vital. I think that's how you can tell whether the treatment is the right treatment.
So how do you define trauma?
Okay, let's start with the hard question. Trauma now is basically PTSD as defined in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual. And at that time, it was seen mainly as a brain disorder, maybe even a brain disease. And it really has to do with being on edge, being hypervigilant all the time, having flashbacks. That's an important component. Although I found that many people with trauma don't have flashbacks, but have things that stuck in their body. And and so forth. So those are sometimes called the big T traumas. But if you look at just the Latin for trauma, it is something more like a wound or an injury. And many of us, probably most of us, have injuries that have affected us, and we don't often know exactly how they affect us. We're in a situation with somebody and all of a sudden we're angry, or our guts tighten up, or our shoulders become tense. And these are replays of things the body has done many, many, many years ago. But it lies dormant, ready to be activated. I really don't believe that anybody's wound is better or worse than somebody else's. This is something, again, that we all experience, and we don't need to redefine it as specific in PTSD. Now, when I developed somatic experiencing, that's the work that I taught, that I've developed and taught, that was still about 13 years in the future when trauma as PTSD would be defined. So I didn't know the trauma was supposedly a brain disorder, maybe even a brain disease, that at best could be managed with medications and with helping people change their negative thoughts about themselves. And I'm not saying that they're completely wrong, but it's very limited. So I look much more globally at trauma, not just as PTSD, it can be, of course, but as something more embodied. So in other words, we see something that's horrible and our guts twist up. And then we see they're really injured and our guts really twist up. Or if we were hit as a child, our shoulders start to become chronically tense, and people experience that often as chronic pain. So these are all things that the body does to protect, to defend, but also to experience injury mutely with somebody else. But there are many things that can trigger it, but that's certainly one. And it can get stuck in the belly. So the first time, the brain tells the body that there's threat, that there's injury. And then when we look and see the person's really hurt, really injured, then it goes even deeper and it twists even more. So maybe that night, when we're laying in bed, all of a sudden we see flashbacks of the images from that day. And again, we notice our guts are all twisted. Now, if it's a brain disorder, then there's nothing we can do about it, except what I said before, to manage it with medication. But at the same time, if it's something that's happening in the body, then there is something that we can do about it. So I can give you a couple of examples, and if people want to join me, that would be fine. Is that okay, Jason?
Sure.
Okay. So let's go back to that example where you go outside and you see the person injured. And our brains are prepared to respond to injury, particularly injury in another person. And our guts twist, and then they twist. And if they twist even more, then they can become chronic and can be experienced in some ways like irritable bowel syndrome. So you want to be able to send a message from the body, in this case from the guts, back up to the brain, so that the brain then knows that the threat is over. You want to be able to send a signal back from the gut that contradicts the experience of injury, of overwhelm, and so forth. So one of the things I found that are very helpful, well, first of all, there's this enormous nerve in the body, and it goes from the back of the brainstem down into the body, into the guts and heart and lungs. It's called the vagus nerve. And that nerve is the biggest, largest nerve in the body by far. But what many people don't know is that 80% of that nerve fiber and nerve system actually is sensory. It's taking information from our guts and then bringing it into our awareness. So I've tried many different things to get a new signal from the gut. And one of the ways is the use of a sound that of VOO, V-O-O-O. And the idea is to take an easy breath and on the exhalation, let the breath and the sound go all the way out, and then wait for the next breath to come in, filling belly, chest, and then repeat one more time. So I can demonstrate.
Yes, please do.
Again, the idea is to actually make the sound as though, well, it is coming from the belly. So you're stimulating these receptors because 80% of that nerve is sensory, is afferent, is information that's coming from the guts to the brain, from the rest of the body to the brain. So, and again, it's not that well known. So if you can get a signal back up from the guts, for example, up through the sensory part of the vagus nerve, then we can take it out of that shutdown threat injury perception. Okay. So, I'm vibrating right in my belly. Then just wait for the breath to come in on its own, filling belly and chest. So just the sound of. So if some of you want to do it, then please don't feel that you have to do it if it doesn't feel right for you. Usually it brings up sensations of warmth, of relaxation, but it also can bring up things that have happened in the past. But again, the idea in trauma, in somatic experiencing, we don't go directly into the trauma. We just touch into the traumatic sensations, feelings, images, and thoughts. So again, those of you who wish, and then let the breath come in, fill belly, chest, and once again, and then just rest and notice sensations, feeling, images, thoughts, whatever comes into your awareness. Just note them. You might even want to just write them down.
So with regards to that sound, is that something that we should use when we encounter where we're in the middle of a traumatic experience? Should we use that when we're anxious and we're thinking about a traumatic experience? Is it something we can use to calm down a child who's having a meltdown? How should we think about frequency, duration? Should I use this before bedtime? Is this how I fall asleep? But I think for listeners, it's pretty, there's something magical about that sound, just hearing it for the first time.
No, absolutely. I mean, all of the above are true. All of the above, just what you described. I mean, chanting has been used for not hundreds of years, but probably thousands of years. And so something doesn't really stick around that long unless there's value to it. Now, this particular sound is to work, again, with the belly area to activate the vagus nerve, and then which then ascends to the brain, and the brain gets the signal you can let go, you can relax, just it's okay. you're safe enough. So yeah, for sure. I mean, you can use it again. Just do it a couple of rounds, and if it brings up difficult sensations, you probably don't want to do it. When you're starting to be in bed. But for most people, for many of us, we actually get a release. We get a new signal from the gut that says to the brain, okay, the threat is over. You can put it in the past. You can let it go.
So you started off, we started talking about trauma and your definition was centered around a traumatic event that we experienced. But what about a traumatic event that our ancestors experienced, ancestral trauma? How do we go about navigating that? It is a black hole for many. I don't know the trauma that maybe my mother or father had when they were a kid, and they're not talking about it. Well, my father's, been dead for 30 years. So I missed that boat. So
when I started working with people in the early 70s, people would report sensations, smells, sensory impressions that they had never personally experienced, but that were rather experienced from their parents, their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, and so on. At first, I didn't talk about it because, it would have seemed outlandish. But now it's absolutely clear that happens, and that happens routinely. And how I came to work with it, that is a whole other story.
let's hear it.
Well, where do I start? Let me start with an encounter that I had with Albert Einstein. And this was an instance of active imagination. So when I was working on my doctoral dissertation and starting to treat people with this mind-body approach, body-mind approach, I would go to my favorite restaurant, usually a couple of times a week. And they greeted me by name, the waitress is there. And they always served me, usually I started with a bowl of warm soup with a French bread that was cut into pieces and was crispy on the outside and soft and moist on the inside. So I would stay there, and then sort of the stresses of the day would kind of recede. So one day, as I'm sitting there starting to have my soup, I see this image of this man, strange. He was had wild, crazy hair, and he was wearing a suit jacket that was like crumpled and was like 2 or 3 times the right size. So he motioned to the other chair. I think he was asking me to invite him. So I did. And we began a conversation. In the book, I called it Conversations with Albert at the Beggars Banquet. And I would ask him questions related to what I was working on. And instead of answers, he would ask me questions about my question. And it's really kind of the approach that Socrates used when people would ask him questions. So it's like a Socratic dialogue. As I say, at that time, I'm a scientist. I'm working with my doctorate in medical biophysics. And so I knew that this wasn't real. It was somehow my unconscious meeting my conscious minds to feed me wisdom that was much greater than just knowledge. And so, as I said, this went on for a good part of a year. One of my last sessions with the professor, I asked him about how people experience trauma that didn't happen to them, but that happened to ancestors. And in this dream image, it's sort of like a dream within a dream. He took me to a small pond and he held a yardstick. And on the yardstick were all kind of small stones. So he just held it over the pond and then twisted it, and they all fell down to the water. And of course, waves went on in all directions. And I realized that I was actually talking to the right man, because she had a lot to say about space and time. So again, the time is not something that just goes forward, but it also goes sideways and backwards. But then he gave me the most important insight. If 2 of these wave fronts get stuck somehow, then everything after that and before that, amazingly, have a distortion in their energy field. Now, what exactly I mean by energy field, we can maybe go into that later. But clearly, this is something that, again, just didn't go in one direction, but went in all directions. And so I asked the professor, I said, can you tell me how to work with that? And he kind of settled in a somber way. And he said, Peter, I don't have the answer to this, but I know that you will find it. And so for the next 2 or 3 years, I really worked in how to help people when they've been affected, and not only adversely, because sometimes things that come through the ancestors are life-affirming and even life-saving. I remember one of the instances where this became absolutely clear. There was an airplane crash going from Denver to Chicago, flight United 232. And the rear engine is a DC-10. The rear engine exploded, and it severed all of the lines coming from the hydraulic system. So there was no real way to control the plane. So what the pilots did is they just used made one engine go faster than the other to try to keep it somewhat stable. But then it landed in a cornfield, and it broke apart. And again, in somatic experience, we don't go to the worst part. In this case, I went with when she knew that she had survived, and feeling and knowing that she was okay, that she survived. But how did that happen? So we go back to the airplane. She's upside down. The fuselage is crushed. Other fuselages are exploding. And she doesn't know what to do. It's all black. And then she hears a voice saying, Katie, go to the light, go to the light. And then she noticed a small pinhole of light, and she crawled there and was able to escape. So that message saved her life. But where did that message come from? Well, both her father and her grandfather had been in airplane crashes. One was in a commercial flight, the other was in a military flight. And both of them had escaped by crawling to where they saw some light. So how did that information go there, especially at that time? There's a movie starring Jeff Bridges and Rosie Perez. It's called Fearless. It's really about that flight. And I know that because I talked to the director, Peter Weir, about it.
A lot to unpack. Before we go to the flight, I want to come back to your conversations with Albert Einstein. What's the clinical explanation?
As I said, the clinical explanation was that this was an example of active imagination. It's a way of the unconscious and conscious minds to meet each other.
And why is that so powerful? And how do we do it?
Well, I did a little research on that. It's something that Jung talked about, Carl Jung. The common knowledge is it's only something that children have, that we lose it as adults. And I thought, that is the stupidest thing I've heard. We need this more for adults than child, because then we're bringing in that vital, alive part, that inner child, into our being, into our heart, into our guts. I definitely don't see it as a pathology. But again, part of me, of course, absolutely knew that this was an imaginary encounter, that Einstein really wasn't there. Okay, so fast forward 35 years ago, I was visiting my parents in New York, and I had spent the day downtown going to different museums and enjoying the city. So at the end of the day, I took the D train up to 205th Street, walked up the hill, opened the door to my parents' apartment, and the two of them were sitting on a sofa. And I walked in, I didn't think anything about it, but I noticed that there was a bookshelf ahead of them, and one of the books was standing out a little bit more than the others. And it was Albert Einstein's General Theory of Relativity. So I was kind of caught by that. And my mother could be quite intuitive. It was a very difficult relationship, and she was very intuitive. That's a part that I don't know if she was aware. I'm sure she wasn't aware of it. And I told her about my story about my imaginary encounter. And she said something like, Peter, I know why this happened to you. And I said, what? So when I was 8, my mother was 8 months pregnant with me. And she and my father were canoeing on a lake in New Jersey. And the wind came up behind them and tipped over the canoe. And they couldn't right the canoe. And they surely would have perished. And I wouldn't be talking to you today. Fortunately, along came a small sailboat. And there were 2 people in the boat. And they pulled my parents onto the boat for safety. And they announced themselves, ready for this, as Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter. And my mother intuited that in such great distress and being saved, that it became like a bond with him. I became a bond with Einstein. And he would be there if I needed something from him or needed questions or needed support. Because, I reflect back on knowing or unknowing that this was an imaginary process. But obviously, he wasn't there in life. First of all, he died many years before that. But there was something in between of different realities, I guess you could say. And I think that gave me another insight into where we intuit and get information from. And again, it helped me continue to develop my work in working with people.
I think a lot of people are saying to themselves, wow, hearing your personal story. And I think the question I have is, do we all have experiences like this? How does one determine if this is monkey brain or chatter or intuition or maybe an NDE, a near-death experience? It feels like you as when your mother's woman had an NDE, and hearing the plane, that was a near-death experience. So there's a lot to
unpack.
Oh yeah, am I experiencing this, in my everyday life? How does one do the work to decipher between all of these?
Yes, I believe that this occurs with in some form with most of us. I think one of the ways that I started to develop this is through recording my dreams and desiring a dream when I'm laying in bed and falling asleep. So by working with dreams, you're working with a similar interface with the unconscious and conscious mind. And I think with discipline and practice, we all can develop that skill. I don't think it's just something that only small children do. It's a powerful ally. I guess what I would call it, an ally, and can be evoked with discipline, with practice, and especially learning how to contact that in the depth.
Yes, a perfect lead. Chapter 3 is titled "Dream Show Us the Way." So how can we be more intentional when it's bedtime, rather than let the dream happen to me? Let's make the dreams work for me.
Put it this way. This is not exactly right, but it's a way of looking at it. The unconscious can partake tremendous in amount of wisdom to us. But if we're not really committed to that, it's like the unconscious just doesn't bother. Okay, if the conscious mind is not interested to where they're writing all of these dreams, why bother give them to them? So I think it's a little bit something like that. We do have to cultivate not only a practice, but a relationship, and a relationship with that part of ourselves. So I think when we really desire and feel that desire to our unconscious minds, our unconscious processes, they will start to give us that information. Certainly that's my experience.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of mindbodygreen and the host of the mindbodygreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. How does one begin that process? Let's say, okay, we've got listeners who are conscious and they're open. They want to begin this process, and they go to bed and they have a dream, and then they wake up. What should they do next? Should they write down their dream? Should they? How do they begin to interpret? Because I know dream interpretation is a whole other
Yeah. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the relationship in writing it down. And then if you notice an image that seems to stand out, or an image that's the opposite, to just go back and forth with that image, whatever it is, and your body, and just shift back and forth. Eugene Gendlin wrote a good book. I forget exactly what he called it, but it was something like, Let Your Body Talk Your Dream, something like that. And so interpretation can be helpful. If you're working with somebody who's experienced with that kind of information, they can be helpful. When I teach in Switzerland, I'm usually there for 4 or so months during the summertime. And I worked with a Jungian analyst there, a woman who was 86 years old, very present. And so sometimes we interpret the dream. She interprets the dream. But other times I just kind of go through the feelings of the dream, and then she'll help me connect deep to that. But dreams have really informed my life. In a way, if I think about it, a dream is when it made me possible to write the autobiography, to write the book. And so when I first started, I had no intention of actually writing it as a book. It was more just a journal for myself, in a way, connecting to my dream world. And so I couldn't decide. I have a friend of mine. She said, Peter, you really need to publish this as a book. And I thought, it's too tender, it's too vulnerable, it's too exposing. There's no way I could do that, too revealing. And she said, I really think it could help people with their own healing. And I definitely couldn't make up my mind. And she said, well, why don't you just think about it? So I would say I was in conflict. I really didn't know which way to go. And often when I'm stuck with something, that's when I'll have an important dream. And of course, I wrote this dream down. So I'm standing in front of a big field, and in my hands, I'm holding a manuscript. And I look to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right. And clearly, I'm conflicted. I'm at least ambivalent. I don't really know what to do. So then a strong wind comes from behind me and takes all of these pages and blows them out to land where they may. And when I awoke, I knew that my unconscious had made the decision to write it as a book and to share this with the intention, the hope that this will help people on their journeys, and maybe even to help people write their own stories. So that's how things began with me. In somatic experiencing, we almost never go right to the core of the trauma. We rather work with something that has sensations and feelings that contradict the feelings of overwhelm and helplessness. So around this time, I was starting to have troubling sensations, feelings, flashes of images. And, Chiron, the Greek archetype for the wounded healer, it was time for me to do my own healing, time to take a dose of my own medicine. So I asked one of my students, very present young woman, to sit with me and to guide me. And so what came up first was the memory of when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And in the middle of the night, my parents had snuck into the room, and they put a set of tracks for a model train set underneath my bed, into the room, back down to the other side of the room, and then back down underneath the bed. So when I awoke, it was, I don't even have the words for it. It was joy, it was excitement, it was exuberance. That's probably the closest one, exuberance. And I jumped out of bed, and I went to the transformer so I could control the speed and make it stop and start, and toot the horn. And though I didn't have the words for it at that time, I knew that I was cared for, that I was loved. And there's quite a bit of research that shows if a person has had even one experience of being supported, of being cared for, or being loved, they'll make it. And that will be like a trunk of their experience or a root of, of their experience. But then this led to another experience, which was more like a body memory. And my guide noticed a slight shuffling in my feet. And she brought my attention to it, and I could feel it. And then she said, now can you slow it down? Really slow it down. And I did. And some strong sensations and feelings and emotions arose when I slowed it down. So when I was probably about eight or nine at the beginning, our family had a really deep crisis. My father was called upon to testify against a man named Johnny DiGuardo, Johnny Dio. He's the Al Capone of New York. And he was probably the most violent of all of those people, and featured in two movies, The Goodfellas and The Irishman. And when people wanted to make a hit, that was the person they would do it because he was the most violent and people feared him. So we were living with that undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. And what my parents should have done, but what they didn't do, is tell us that we would be protected, that we would be taken care of, even though it was a frightening situation. But they didn't. They never spoke about it. But all of us, me and my brother, knew that something was wrong. And we could sense our parents' fear and anxiety. And one night I would sneak out from my bedroom and go underneath a small table, a telephone table. And every couple of weeks, the mafia, I found out later, sent a lawyer over to tell my parents how to testify, to plead the Fifth Amendment and so forth. So it was like the stress of this was like pulling my legs from under me. My legs are really wobbly. So then what came up while I was being guided is a sensation in my legs, and I followed that. And they led to the body memory of when I would come home from junior high school, and I would have my milk and cookie snack. Then I would go downstairs, go across the road to the Reservoir Oval Park, climb this wrought iron fence, and then went down from some bushes to a running track below. And I would start to walk faster and faster, and then start to run. And in doing that, I was starting to get the feeling of my legs back. So again, the images from the train birthday surprise, and then the running on the track to bring my body back into some kind of aliveness. One day, something very different happened. And again, I climbed the fence, let myself down, and I noticed a whole bunch of what these must have been mafiosa, these guys that were smoking cigarettes and wearing these motorcycle kind of hats, Marlon Brando hats. And I knew something was wrong. The hair on my neck and on the back of my neck and my back just stood up. And I knew I had to do something. And I realized if I ran to try to go up the fence, I would be an easy target. So instead, I ran down through the bushes, but I didn't get through the bushes because as I entered the bushes, somebody pulled me down and I was violently assaulted and raped. And with my guidance, I was able to complete that, to go back to the power in my legs, go back to the care of being taken for care and love for, and bring them back. And I was able then to put this in the past where it belonged instead of an everyday haunting. And so so I was healing and she was helping me heal this deep wound, this deep trauma. So that maybe gives you a little idea about where the dream world can take you, where the imagination can take you.
It's powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm sure, for all the people who've experienced trauma with the big T, how do they know when talk therapy just isn't going to cut it? How do they know that they need to do deeper work, that maybe somatic experiencing is what's going to finally liberate them?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's somatically based because, again, and I can't reiterate this more, is that trauma is something that happens in our bodies. We brace against being hit. Then we develop a tension pattern and then pain and so forth. So these are all signals that we're holding on to something. And people often ask, or sometimes ask, is that something I can do by myself? And there's a Motown song that goes something like, "It takes one to stand in the dark alone. It takes two to let the light shine through." And that person was my guide, was a student, but then she became a guide, and I trusted and let myself be in her hands. But many of us, particularly if this is big trauma, we have hauntings. We have things that happen kind of out of the blue. For example, we're at a party and we meet somebody, and all of a sudden we feel terror and rage. Where's that coming from? And this is a person you don't even know. But somehow he reminds us of someone that we experienced in the past. So hauntings, physical symptoms, pain is often one that we can follow and takes us really to a trauma. But again, it has to be worked with in this way that I'm just describing. So we're not just plunging head on into the trauma.
What about when the opposite happens, when we meet someone and we're drawn to them, and we want to be around them and we feel good around them?
Well, if that's really the case, then you might want to cultivate a friendship with this person. You might want to say, well, let's go out, let's meet, maybe go out and have some tea or coffee or lunch. However, sometimes when we've been traumatized, we're drawn to somebody, to the trauma person, and we're drawn to somebody who reminds us of that. Sometimes it's called a trauma bond. So we want to be careful about that. We want to be judicious. We want to take the time to get to know somebody and see if they really are a person that would be nourishing, that we might want to cultivate a friendship with. So I would say in all cases, either we're just like we repulsed and we just have to escape, or we're attracted to them like they're our long lost friend. In both of those, we want to be cautious and see where those feelings might be coming from.
On that note, I think you're hitting on a nerve for many people who've been in relationships that haven't worked out and maybe attracted to someone who was unavailable or attracted to someone who had similar qualities to maybe someone who was the source of a lot of pain in their life. And they're looking to heal that wound. How do you talk about that?
Well, you're talking about patterns. You can call them complexes. I prefer the term pattern. So when we meet somebody, we have engrams of what a relationship is like. And sometimes it can be deceptive because that can say, well, this was a traumatic encounter with this person. So again, when you meet somebody and you're drawn to them, I think it's important to explore what kind of engram they're meeting from in your life. And I'm not saying that, if they're similar to somebody that you can't be friends with them, but to do cautiously. People ask, well, should I tell people what happened to me? And I'll say, only somebody you trust. Otherwise, don't say anything at all. And, because again, that can be, I don't know if re-traumatizing is the word, I guess it is, but something that's really reactivating older patterns, older complexes.
How do we, other than, look, everyone should pick up the book, I'll hold it up, an autobiography of trauma, the healing journey. The healing journey is key. Gotta mention the healing part of this. How does one So in addition, please pick up the book. How can people start to strengthen some of these muscles on a daily basis? The same way you want to get fit, you go to the gym, or you run, or you do whatever you need to do to strengthen the body. Is it meditation? Is it breath work? Is it, what else? What can people do and incorporate into maybe an already busy life? Just start strengthening those muscles to be more aware, to maybe have more dreams that can, shed some light on maybe past traumas or inform their decisions.
Meditation can be helpful, but it's really important to bring the body in, to give the body its due. And as for breath work, there are many, many different kinds of breath work. And one of the more well-known, I guess, is to do a hyperventilation. And while this can kind of help uncover things, we have to be careful about it, because I think what's most important about breath is to be able to follow breath, to let there be a full exhalation. Doing the VO exercise can be helpful in that regard. So again, just letting the air all the way out. Let the air come in through the nose. And then a deep and sustained exhalation. And the VO, of course, really takes us into our bodily sense. I think the key is, again, in the bodily sense. So let's just say somebody's having chronic pain in their shoulders. That's pretty common, especially with those of us who have been traumatized. So what I would suggest is, as you feel the pain, can you begin to sense a tension that's underneath the pain? And often the person then will say, oh gosh, yeah, I feel a lot of tension there. So then what happens if you actually slowly increase the tension so that the shoulders go up to the ears? Again, but way more slower than this, and just a little bit at a time. So again, just slowly bringing your shoulders up and letting them go. And notice sensations, feelings, thoughts, images that come up when you do this. Again, if it becomes too much, I suggest that you work with a somatically based therapist. I'll give you the website later, but we can go to places, because it's taught in 44 countries now, to where you can find a therapist. And those of you who are interested to also find trainings. But again, I think to do exercises like the breath, like the VO, and like working with pain, what might be underneath the pain, and slowly going into that tension a little bit more, holding it there, and letting it drop, and just feel, sense, feel, observe. And if something comes up that's unpleasant, you can always see if you're willing to trust yourself to be with this and have compassion for yourself, to develop a sense of self-compassion. And I think that kind of mind-bodyfulness takes us in that direction. So rather than calling it mindfulness, I think I say mind, it really is mind-body awareness.
It feels like massage can be a powerful tool for people.
Yes and no.
Okay, let's hear it.
Sometimes yes, because what we may need is to really slow things down and use body awareness. With some massage people, that's the direction they go in. But sometimes it's just a matter of releasing the muscle or bringing more pleasure, which is fine, which is great. But it's not necessarily going to really kind of uncover what might be held in the body. But with many people, it can do exactly that. So it's certainly worth trying. And if you want to do that, find somebody you know, an acquaintance, a friend that works with a certain massage therapist, or maybe even more like a body worker, maybe a craniosacral body worker. So it's, you have to find out what works for you. For somebody who has had, for example, sexual trauma, if it's a woman, then it's probably best, if it's going to be direct body work, to be with a masseuse who's a woman. I don't say this is 100%, but I think it's an important guideline. And with a man who's had sexual trauma, sometimes it's best to work with a man, sometimes it's best to work with a woman. But again, somebody who really is that, in one of my books, In an Unspoken Voice, I wrote that trauma isn't so much, it's not just really what happened to us, but it's rather what we hold inside of that present, empathetic other, and to trust them enough to hold that space, as my guide did, to go into with curiosity and exploration of our hauntings, of our pain, of our tension patterns, and see what pattern might be there.
Beautiful. Peter, we covered a lot of ground today. In closing, is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to, or you want to leave our audience with some words of wisdom? Or
people ask me, can you ever get over a trauma? And I said, well, the good news and the bad news about this is that trauma is a fact of life. At some time in our lives, we'll experience high levels of distress. Whether you call it trauma or something else, it doesn't matter. But the good news is that it doesn't have to be a life sentence. With the right tools, trauma doesn't have to rule. With the tools, appropriate tools and guidance, then trauma can rule. So again, that's another important thing to realize about healing trauma, is that it's so important, at least initially, to get some guidance from somebody who's experienced and who's done their own healing work. That's another one that's important. I would never work with somebody who hasn't done their own healing work. It's just likely to either be ineffective or re-traumatizing. And if people want to get more information about my work and books and so forth, they can go to the website. It's somaticexperiencing.com, somaticexperiencing, one word, .com. And there's a lot more information and video material. There's a video of a work I did with a Marine who was blown up by 2 explosive devices in Afghanistan. And that was right after his best friend died in his arms. And you see the way he's able to come back into life. And I think any trauma therapy, it's certainly true of somatic experiencing, is a therapy that brings us back into our bodies and into life, to be feeling alive and real and alive and vital. I think that's how you can tell whether a treatment is the right treatment.
Peter, thank you so much.